Saturn moves into Aries. It's going to stay there for about 3 years with a brief return into Pisces at the end of 2025. And then it will move back to Aries along with Neptune January and February 2026. And both of them will be conjunct at the 0 degree of Aries, which is the inception degree of the zodiac, on February 20, 2026. There's a full article on that on my website, which, if you haven't read it yet, is really worth examining. It goes extensively into the meanings of this conjunction, which I refer to as the most important conjunction of the decade. So mauricefernandez.com, check the article, and you will see it there. This time, however, I want to focus more specifically on Saturn in Aries, because following the early 2026 conjunction with Neptune, Saturn moves much faster and will then be on its own in Aries. And so that is worth our examination today. Before we move on, just reminding you to subscribe to the channel and support the work. I also invite you to join my Facebook group, Evolutionary Skies, where we talk about astrology. You know, everybody's invited as long as you are polite and you contribute. So check it out. If you want to go deeper into this material and astrology from an evolutionary point of view, I offer a diploma course. So it goes deep into understanding, mastering a chart analysis, big cycles, health, vocation, relationships. So it's a really rich program. You can also go to the website and find a workshop that's exclusively on Saturn. And so what is the advantage of that? You go to the website, Learn Astrology by topic, and then you scroll, you see all the workshops available, which they're all great, I promise. But Saturn and the karmic wheel, this goes into every placement of Saturn in the chart and what it means from a karmic point of view. What is the soul trying to realign, and what are the karmic risks? So it's a deep 12-hour immersion into the subject. Yeah, a lot of resources available, and it's high quality material. So back to Saturn in Aries now. Looking at previous cycles, Saturn was in Aries in the late 60s, from March 67 to April 69. And this was, a time where there were many important changes politically and so forth. Because Saturn in Aries is about implementing the policies, the agenda. We move from theory to action. Obviously, it's a very cardinal energy. Both Saturn is a cardinal planet, Aries a cardinal sign. So they're very much action-oriented, practical, let's get things done approach. So this was, the height of the summer of love, the strong, social movement to liberate from social conditioning and find autonomy, agency, Aries, for your life, Saturn. Excuse me. And so this was also a time where we had two assassinations in 1968, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. So this attempt to get things done can also mean people taking the law, Saturn, into their hands, Aries. And you can have such actions, which can at times, be the vigilante violence. um, there were also a lot of new projects. This was just before the moon landing, which was summer of 69, which is not specifically a Saturn in Aries event, but the Saturn in Aries helps galvanize, energize, direct energy towards certain goals. It's very goal oriented. So if your goal is the moon, you're going to get there with Saturn in Aries. The following cycle was in between 1996 and 99. Notice how this cycle began around the Aries season. So Saturn moves into Aries when the sun is close to Aries. This is very much the way it works astronomically. Slow-moving planets move to a new sign when the sun is around there. So that in the late 90s was the middle, or towards the end of the wars in Yugoslavia. So the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, leading to many new countries and redrawing the maps. So that was a Saturn Neptune event, the dissolving of an empire. But then you had a lot of identity crisis. Who are we and what are we to become? So Saturn in Aries about forging your way forward and finding your own footing, trying to know who you are. And so in some countries, this happened more peacefully. But in Yugoslavia, it was a lot of ethnic tension between Muslims and Christians and the different regions, Bosnia, Serbia, and towards the 90s, the late 90s, was the war in Kosovo with infamous Slobodan Milosevic, who was later indicted for war crimes. The same with another ex-Yugoslavian leader, Radovan, don't remember his last name. But these two leaders were arrested by the International Courts of Justice in The Hague and were basically accused of war crimes. So, interesting timing 30 years later. Other things that occurred during this Saturn in Aries was the second term of President Clinton election in the United States and the whole Monica Lewinsky scandal, which happened when Saturn in Aries was square Neptune in Capricorn. So you had another Saturn-Neptune, and the shaking and fall from grace of an otherwise, very, very popular president. And so Aries has a lot to do with manhood and military and being the hero. And Saturn brings that scrutiny, use your energy carefully, use your sexual energy carefully. So this is just a glimpse, there's much more to these years and much more to unpack. But if we look at some of the key events of previous Saturn in Aries cycles, interestingly, one of the major, leading athletes, gymnast Simone Biles, was born in the late 90s with Saturn in Aries on her nose, and the ruler Mars in Virgo on her north node. If the time is correct, then it's in the 10th house. And so Mars in Virgo is one of the most athletic configuration, in the entire zodiac. Mars in Virgo people are masters of their bodies, sometimes pushing it to, that kind of posture, limber, and so they are really physically very strong. But the Saturn in Aries adds to the physical mastery, physical Aries, mastery Saturn. And so it shows. Another really powerful figure of that generation, born in 97, Malala Yousafzai, who, living in Pakistan, was protesting at her young age the need for girls to have an education, to be able to go to school. And her story was dramatized by the fact that she was shot by the Taliban, who wanted to silence her, and she survived the attack and became a spokesperson and went through, intense healing and activism. So you see that Saturn in Aries in her eighth house square her sun in Cancer, speaking for the feminine, speaking for the empowerment of women. And, this kind of intense violence, a very harsh regime, totalitarian, violent. And yet, her currency is freedom. Let us be who we're meant to be, Aries. So we see here both sides of the Saturn in Aries, the aggressive regime that she was under, and her own heroism, her own activism to stand up to the evil forces. Another interesting candidate of Saturn in Aries, Einstein, and pay attention to the fact that, we know Einstein for his genius, not for his good manners, not for his fathering skills, but for his brain and capacity to understand riddles of the universe. And so that Saturn in Aries is atop the chart, and it's conjunct Mercury, which is knowledge and education and learning. So that Saturn Mercury shows individuality in Aries, but also shows mastery. Some people, will mistakenly say that Saturn Mercury aspect will make you dumb and slow. Well, talk to Einstein. Um, and a pioneer, in all the things he did. Some of the tragic events, Saturn in Aries was, the death of Princess Diana in 97. Look at that degree, that 19 degrees that keeps coming back. So that same summer that Malala was born, a month later, Diana died or was killed in a car crash in Paris. So a lot of controversy around that event. And that's the chart of her passing. So she sort of, she was alive for a few hours and then transitioned. And then, as I mentioned, the assassination of Martin Luther King. And later that year, Martin Luther King was in April. not only was Saturn conjunct the sun, exactly, I mentioned how Saturn, how when the planet is conjunct the sun, is a very, very important rite of passage. So here he died with the Saturn sun in Aries on the North Node. So it's an eclipse season. And Chiron had just moved into Aries as well. And you have an assassination also under Neptune in Scorpio. So the time of Neptune in Scorpio brought also the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 63, and then Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 68. So we see here again political tension, violence. So where are we at? Let's look at some of the key words. Saturn in Aries is about asserting Aries, the rights and wrong. Saturn, what's right, what works, what doesn't work. So it's a more firm way of cutting, deciding, stop debating, be more direct. So it's a level of firmness about where you stand, about what we need to do, but also the moral discernment of rights and wrong is much more black and white. Right and wrong is clear under Saturn in Aries, for better and worse. So it can mean taking action to right the wrongs. And it's interesting that in the previous cycle, you had a lot of gestures, efforts to correct war crimes. This is when New Zealand recognized the abuse of the Maori people, and they offered, financial compensation. This was the time also where eventually, arrest warrant were made for Slobodan Milosevic, and he was eventually arrested in 1999 for war crimes. So there's something about Saturn that brings morality and brings correction to the action, especially military war crimes, more emphasized. But on a personal level, even if you're not a soldier and you're not, using weapons, it is about what are the right action? What's the right course of action? Both on a practical level, what do you need to do to succeed? What do you need to do to make your relationship work? But also, what is the right thing to do? The morality. Where do you stand? You can't just escape these moral questions anymore. So this is a time to really discern, do the right thing, how to avoid failure, how to do things that will bear fruit. So measure your actions. So it brings more wisdom, more maturity to the way you proceed, which sometimes can also lead to fear of taking action, fear of causing harm. Some people with Saturn in Aries, born with that signature, can be people who, are afraid of coming on too strong, afraid that they may cause harm. So they're they hold back. It's almost like they made mistakes in the past and they need to now measure their way forward, be more cautious. So once again, there's a practical side to the caution. Don't waste your money, don't break the machine. But there's also a moral side, do no harm. Um, be careful what you push too hard, because there is a risk of using excessive force. There is a risk of violence in wanting to do the right thing. It Saturn in Aries can be imposing force. It can be forceful. That combination can get to the point of physical harm, because you want to correct something and do the right thing, and you end up this elephant in a china shop, bull in a china shop, and breaking everything. So there's also a physical risk of injury. We speak about athletes. They need to be careful about injuries. Simone will be needing to look at her Saturn return. So firmness in accountability, you have the heroes of Saturn in Aries and the criminals of Saturn in Aries. And war, Aries, crime, Saturn, accountability for your action. So when we speak about where we're coming from, with the Israeli Gaza Palestinian question and the whole debate about war crimes and the arrest warrant, this is very likely going to move quickly forward during Saturn in Aries, and the same with Ukraine, Russia, and who knows what other issue and country may erupt or be scrutinized. So what's very interesting with Saturn in Aries, it risks, it has this double side of Saturn on the one hand wanting to do good in the Aries field, so wanting to have the right action, to take responsibility for the abuse of force, the abuse of authority. And so there are a lot of questions about repairing, like we said, taking responsibility for crimes, war crimes or battles. But there's also the shadow side, which Saturn in Aries can encourage war crimes, can be the bully, and can be very firm and harsh in punishment. It's very black and white. And so it's a very authoritarian Saturn. And it can, if it's mishandled, become oppressive, forceful. The authority, Saturn, forces their agenda. And so, people are talking about, will there be martial law? Think about martial, Aries, law, Saturn. Will the government go nuts? It's a risk with Saturn in Aries. And Neptune is there too, right? So our achievements, Saturn always shows how can you succeed? What's the top of the mountain? What are you climbing towards? So with Aries, your achievement are action oriented. This is why you have the heroes, the saviors, and you have the competitors, and the sports, and the necessary battles, the activists, which Malala is a very good example of how courageous, withstanding, knowing that she could get killed. She stands up for what is morally right and pays a huge price. But karmically, she's rewarded with recognition and becoming a voice for women. And so we need to talk about the Neptune-Saturn conjunction in Aries. So the first step of that conjunction will be in the summer of 2025. And so as they come together in June, both of them are now in Aries officially. Jupiter moves into Cancer at the same time, and they form a square. This Jupiter-Saturn square has been ongoing since 2024, when Saturn was in Pisces, Jupiter in Gemini. They kept moving forward, retrograde in Gemini and Pisces. We have to also go to the original conjunction. They conjuncted at 0 degrees Aquarius in 2020, the year 2020, right after Biden won the election and Trump contested the results of the election. So that was a very tense political battle. Now Trump is back in power. He is born with a Saturn-Jupiter square himself. And for the past few months has really activated this Saturn in Pisces square Jupiter in Gemini with, Jupiter in Gemini is all about immigration, foreigners, education. And Trump, has been the Saturn with deportation of immigrants and a lot of ethical dilemmas, whether he's doing it the right way or not. Always when you have Jupiter Saturn, there are ethical dilemmas. What's right and wrong becomes a really controversial issue. Add Neptune to the mix, and the risk of slips, the risk of disintegration, the risk of lawlessness, the risk of neglect and abuse is amplified. Now, his whole desire to purge the protests in the universities. Universities is a Jupiterian institution, and Jupiter in Gemini is all about free speech and communication. So Saturn square Jupiter, you see not only the deportation of foreigners, but you see the sanctions imposed on Harvard. Sanctions, Saturn, university, Jupiter. And then a move to bar foreign students, Jupiter in Gemini, who come to study Gemini from other countries. And Saturn squares, like wanting to impose this sanction in the most oppressive way. So, it's one thing to want to curb hate speech. It's one thing to want to control immigration. It's another thing to be authoritarian and violate the Constitution, which is all Saturn, Jupiter themes. Excuse me. So when we see this Saturn, Jupiter coming to an exact last square, meaning it's the last time they will form this opening square. It's going to be now in a new sign of Aries and Cancer. And it will definitely touch not just education because it's not in Gemini anymore, but it will touch, domestic issues, um, definitely nationalism. All of us, during this Aries Cancer square will be feeling that we need to make decisions about our lives. It's a time to reinvent ourselves. We may see elders, leaders, teachers in our lives, transitioning, moving to another phase of their lives. We are adulting. We are, going through some kind of rite of passage, becoming parents, getting a new, career position. A new identity is being forged in this square. So Aries and Cancer is very much about who am I and what are my freedoms? And do I feel Jupiter safe? So the safety and the indulgence of Jupiter in Cancer, note that the United States has Jupiter at 5 Cancer, versus the, the intensity of Saturn in Aries coming with authority, and yet you needing your own freedom. Now, it's interesting that this is exactly the time when Trump wants to have a military parade on his birthday. I mean, that is so Saturn in Aries, military parade. Showing off your big guns. And yet, this is also the time where many protests are counter, responding to that military parade. So the activism of Saturn in Aries, you are not going to tell me what to do, is very interesting. Saturn in Aries can be the regime being forceful, but it is also you standing up to the regime. It is also you wanting to be your own Aries authority, Saturn, and not giving power away. So it's some kind of tug of war at this stage. And we can suspect with Saturn, Neptune, first of all, that there will be slips, that there will be dramatic changes in the whole political map. Hopefully, in a positive way. The positive side of Neptune is that it can pacify, it can soften the Saturn, and so the change can occur more in a more fluid way. But now let's speak about Neptune-Jupiter square, which can also describe some kind of disillusionment, bubble burst. Always Jupiter, Neptune, big, 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 big burst. Things that you know, went too far, paid too much money for, had too many high expectations. It's time to downsize. It shrinks. It deflates. So it's interesting, again, to have the parade, which is so inflated around then. What will happen with that? But it could mean, we could see leaders falling from grace. we could also see leaders becoming more frail, not just through scandals or a coup, but actually, health issues and not being as strong as they used to be. So there's a risk around these months of June, July of fall down, of people in high position um, losing the grip, losing their position, or willingly relinquishing. There's a relinquishing with Neptune. It's like I'm letting it go. Now, I spoke in that article about Russia and how the Russian history since the early 1900s and before is very much marked by Saturn-Neptune cycles, from the Bolshevik Revolution to the fall of the empire. So, again, check out this article. It's pretty extensive and it goes into these details. Who is more exposed? Another article that I'm referring to you is a new article I posted on specifically Neptune in Aries and what it's here to bring: liberation, nonviolence, universal energy, limitless self. So once again, mauricefernandez.com, check articles, and you'll see it next to this one. So we speak about action, right? And we speak about sovereignty and finding your identity and who am I and who am I becoming. So many of us may go through a phase of restructuring, and it can affect our location, where we want to live, Cancer, who we want to be, Aries, what are we going to do with our lives? Are we going elsewhere? So be careful of plans that are too big, because that aspect can create inflation, deflation. Watch the economy going through the ballooning and the shrinking. See, for yourself, try to be more modest in your steps forward, because there's a risk of collapse if you go too big, too quick. So a lot of balloon popping, bubble bursting. And one of the issues, again, that we speak about, if we speak about sovereignty and we speak about military action, is obviously the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it's the first time now where sovereignties, allies have spoken more firmly, Saturn in Aries, more firmly about the need to stop the war in Gaza and possible sanctions towards Israel. So will Bibi Netanyahu and his far-right extremist government, heed the call? Or is he going to go ahead in trying to, Saturn in Aries, reconquer Gaza and, force Palestinian into exile and destruction? Will this also means the liberation of hostages? Saturn in Aries, square Jupiter in Cancer. So, that's going to be a very interesting dynamic to observe and to track, because this configuration speaks about the need for the Palestinian entity and nation to be recognized as a nation. the nationalism, the identity, the I am, the need to exist, Aries, and to find a homeland, Jupiter in Cancer. And yet, it seems so far now from that. But watch this space. It may be that more and more country will formally recognize, the state of Palestine. Now, Saturn in Aries. Stop Saturn, Aries, the war. With Neptune there, pacifying, the ultimate positive outcome is the end of war. It's the end of hostility. It's about realigning and doing the right thing. So whether that happens in June, there's a ceasefire, and we talk about the Ukraine as well, or whether that happens in the course of these 3 years, you're going to see a lot of development around the need to stop wars. But remember, whatever astrology brings, you'll see the positive and you'll see the shadow. So there will be, instances of excessive force, and there will be attempt to be firm. So diplomatic action needs to be firm. It's not Piscean anymore. You can't wait. You need to be, more rigid, gain more authority. You need to mean business. And that also implies, obviously, the other conflict with Ukraine and Russia, which could end. And as I mentioned, Jupiter, Neptune, Saturn, Neptune often activate massive structural changes in Russia and, in that whole leadership. So will Putin surrender? Will he compromise? Will he fall down? Who knows? Let's watch this space. What I want to bring up to your attention is also, Saturn and Neptune are together. But then you look at Mars, because Mars rules Aries. And Mars is always something to look at because it's, it's all the drama is in Mars. So Mars in August opposes Saturn, Neptune around August 8. So this is going to be very contentious. People look at the Grand Trine, which has to do with alliances, air, who's siding with who. But, if we speak about martial law and if we speak about contentious energy, conflict, this is dangerous. So on a personal level, take care of your bones, be careful about any kind of excessive physical risks. But it can also affect relationships. Is there going to be controversy in your relationships? Are you going to debate the right and wrong in your relationship? And I'm saying relationship because it's in Libra. So right and wrong, am I doing the right thing? Should I break up or not? Should I, follow through my attraction to this other person? You can have a lot of internal moral dilemmas. And we can hope that indeed, this grand trine in air will bring this more to a dialogue and even to harsh debates, not to military conflicts. But if you have planets at 1 degrees cardinal, you're on the spot. Take care of yourself. Later, as I mentioned, February 20, you have the actual exact conjunction in 2026. It's right after an eclipse, a solar eclipse, which means, times of eclipses are always times of major, fast, fated events. Next chart, as Saturn is in Aries, it's still close to Neptune, April 2026. It will then conjunct Mars. Here it opposes Mars. Now it conjuncts Mars in Aries and Mercury. So this is 7 degrees cardinal. The nodes are at 7, Virgo, Pisces. And again, Saturn, Mars aspects are militaristic. They are about larger battles. Now, I speak about that in my article on Neptune, where Neptune in Aries speaks about the sovereignty of your ability to defend yourself. So the Second Amendment of the United States, the right to bear arms for each individual Aries, and everyone, Neptune, has the right to protect themselves. That is a controversial theme because there's been a lot of abuse of this amendment and people, shooting randomly, killing children and whatnot. So I suspect that this time in April is going to, to bring a lot of attention to this issue about your own self-defense, your own ability to stand up for yourself, both from an activist point of view and from a legal point of view. And this whole Second Amendment theme may come to surface at that time. Debates, reforms. And again, this is right after the eclipses and the actual conjunction. So it is a time that is volatile. As Saturn moves into Aries, it separates from Neptune gradually because it's a faster moving planet. But then by late 2026, we have this massive sextile-ish configuration at 4 degrees of all the air fire signs. Pluto-Uranus trine. Then Jupiter in Leo opposing Pluto and Neptune. This, it's hard to describe, but this is rare. Doesn't happen that 4 slow-moving planets, and 5 if you count Saturn, even though it's not at the exact degree, are coming together like that. Usually it implies major social change, major breakthroughs, this kind of redrawing the maps. I don't, in our generation, for the past 100 years, this hasn't happened. But it did happen that Pluto was conjunct Uranus, sextile Neptune in the 60s. And then in the 90s, Uranus, Neptune were together, sextile Pluto. And what happened was the internet revolution, major social movements, civil rights, big revolutions in technology and in social justice. A lot to look forward to. So remember, some of the key words for Saturn in Aries is focus on goals. This is the time where you can, with hard work, with determination, build and get to the top of your hill or your mountain. It is a time for your own personal responsibility and sovereignty. So, it has a lot of issues with hierarchy. Should I listen to my teacher or should I do my own thing? Can anyone tell me what to do? Should I just go and follow my own theme? In a way, it's how to balance that, how to have sovereignty. And true teachers are the teachers who will set you free. So from an Aries, Saturn in Aries point of view, the leader who advances your own liberation, your own individuality, is the leader, is the teacher for you for this time. Those who are overly authoritarian, those who use force because they know nobody else will listen to them without it, are going to face the backlash, are going to face reactions. So many blessings for all of us. I'm sure we're going to have more videos unpacking this, but I just wanted to celebrate Saturn in Aries. And of course, focus on your goal to become a masterful astrologer. Join us in this extraordinary journey to star knowledge. Right now, we're at the end of cycle 14, which means that if you enroll now, you will, without any additional expense, you will merge into the next cycle 15. And so you benefit from all that, the material of cycle 14 and the material of cycle 15. So it's a great time to actually enroll. Many, many blessings and prayers for sanity, for strength, and for the wars to stop. Thank you.